In a world where intelligent people stopped having children while dumb people continued reproducing endlessly, the world is now full of fools who spend their time sitting on their couches with built-in toilets watching ridiculous and overstimulating television programs. In this future, the president is an adult film actor, and scientists only worry about superficial things like hair loss. This film may seem like a simple comedy, but for many, the absurd story is almost a documentary about a future that seems less and less distant. And the worst part is how the same company, Fox, tried to censor it. Everything seemed to indicate that humanity would advance towards a brighter future with increasingly intelligent and stronger people. However, something unexpected happened at the beginning of the 21st century. Instead of evolution selecting the wisest and most capable, the comforts of the modern world meant that anyone, regardless of their intelligence, could reproduce without any restrictions. Humanity, without natural predators to control its numbers, began to multiply unchecked. There are two types of couples. One, very intelligent, who plan more and wait for the right moment, where they never end up doing anything, and the other where life is more unconscious. They simply live day by day and reproduce much more, regardless of the place or circumstances. And this behavior is repeated from generation to generation, while the intelligent couple is only scared by the volatility of the market and how it is not the right time. In this context, in 2005, the United States Army librarian Joe, who is informed that he'll be a part of the experiment. The man is saddened by the news because his job is consistent of sitting around doing nothing, and he doesn't want to be transferred, but he has no other choice. At a high-ranking meeting, General Collins presents a new hibernation capsule capable of preserving people indefinitely. The idea is to keep the best soldiers in their prime and awaken them when needed. Joe is chosen as a test subject because he's the most mediocre soldier in the army, with no family or ties, which avoids questions if something goes wrong. They also need a woman, but finding no suitable candidate in the army, they chose Rita, a woman of the night with no family, who accepts in exchange for money and the dismissal of certain charges. Colin also had to convince Rita's pimp, and photos show the process of convincing him was quite pleasant for both of them, as they enjoyed many parties. He then concludes that the subjects will be placed in capsules the following day, and that the experiment will last a year. It is highly classified. The officers could not share the information. The next day, Joe and Rita wait together. Joe introduces himself and asks Rita which sector she comes from to conceal her work. She says she's from the private sector. Both are connected to and placed in hibernation capsules. Rita panics, but Joe reassures her, saying that the scientists know what they're doing. They probably did animal testing beforehand and that it will only be for a year. Finally, the capsules are sealed, but everything becomes complicated when Collins is arrested for his ties to late-night underworld, as well as Rita's pimp. The scandal causes the military base to be shut down, and the experiment is forgotten. Eventually, the building is demolished, leaving Joe and Rita in hibernation for years. While they sleep, humanity grows stupider. Average intelligence plummets. But instead of addressing the problem, the brightest scientists focus on useless experiments like curing baldness or prolonging erections. The market's only priority, where humanity descends into stupidity, vanity, and promiscuity. Sounds familiar? While the population grows unchecked, intelligence continues to decline until the year 2505. For centuries, humanity has failed to solve basic problems like garbage, which has accumulated without a disposal plan. This leads to the Great Garbage Avalanche of 2505. A massive landslide causes Joe's hibernation pod to end up in a random house. Joe wakes up dizzy and confused in a house where there's a guy who's in the representation of everything that can go wrong with humanity. He ignores the trash and the stranger in his living room while watching an overstimulating program of someone being humiliated time and time again. He only gets up to tell Joe to not make a noise. His sofa has a built-in toilet so he doesn't have to move. He then kicks Joe and throws him out of the window. When this film was released, it seemed like just a silly comedy, but with the passage of time, the idea of a future with completely intellectually decayed society has ceased to seem so absurd. In fact, for many, Idiocracy is more of a documentary than a joke. Are we really so far from a future like the one in Idiocracy? Perhaps the right question isn't whether the world can exist, but how quickly we are building it without realizing it. This is a world inherited by idiots, with the first character that we meet, named Frido Pendejo, which is in Spanish for fried dumbass, who rots his time away sitting so close to a huge screen filled with so much content. This is reminiscent of popular children's clips today, with multiple screens doomscrolling different content. One of the movie's funniest jokes is that the world's brightest scientists are busy solving problems like hair loss and erectile dysfunction. solution, instead of tackling humanity's biggest challenges. It's exaggerated, but it's also a critique of consumerism and the way it influences progress. In the movie, science follows whatever people are willing to pay for. The market decides what gets attention, not necessarily what matters most. The idea isn't completely foreign today. A huge amount of research depends on funding, and funding often follows commercial potential. Companies invest in innovations that can generate revenue, not simply because they expand human knowledge. That doesn't mean science isn't making incredible progress, but it does mean that the market plays a major role in deciding which problems get solved first. The film pushes this idea to an absurd extreme, but it raises an interesting question. How many of breakthroughs we celebrate are actually improving life in meaningful ways? And how many are just creating new needs to sell us more stuff? Disoriented, Joe begins to wander the streets that look like garbage dump. He sees a group of people who speak in slang and grunts, although he understands them. When he speaks a little formal, people of the future find it weird, reacting against him in a violent manner. Still dizzy, Joe goes to a hospital. It's dirty and full of concedo machines that serve as distraction for the patients. At the reception, he tells the receptionist he's in the army. He doesn't feel well, and he doesn't know where he is. She doesn't respond. She just presses a button, and a voice tells him to go to the diagnostic area. Joe tries to drink water from a fountain, but instead, an energy drink with electrolytes comes out. When he asks someone where he can get water, the man laughs and tells him that it's only used in toilets. In this world, everyone uses this type of Gatorade to bathe, drink, and in their daily lives, while water is only for toilets. Joe arrives at the diagnostic area, where he is supposed to have plugs placed in his mouth, ear, and well, in his backside, so that a computer can give him a diagnosis. But the health professional places them in the wrong places. Disgusted, Joe completes the procedure and sent to the doctor. One of the ideas Idiocracy unexpectedly touches on is our growing dependence on technology to do our thinking for us. Many experts say we become comfortable outsourcing not just information, but the mental work that comes with it. We don't bother remembering facts because we know we can search them instantly. Over time, that habit changes how we use our own minds. Instead of exercising our memory, judgment, and problem-solving skills, we increasingly hand those jobs over to algorithms and devices. The more we rely on technology to think for us, the less capable we become thinking independently. And when those systems fail or give us bad information, many people struggle to function without them. Idiocracy exaggerates this idea for comedy. In the hospital scene, the staff blindly trust machines to make every decision, even when they're clearly using them incorrectly, because that critical thinking has been lost. That satire doesn't feel quite as far-fetched as today. Many of us can't navigate a new city without GPS, depend on recommendation algorithms to tell us what to watch or buy, or to turn AI to write emails, summarize articles, or answer questions we would work through ourselves. None of these habits are disastrous in their own, but together they point out towards the same concern. When we constantly outsource thinking, we risk letting our own critical thinking skills slowly fade. While Joe waits for the doctor, he sees the date 2505 in a magazine, but he thinks it's a printing error. The doctor arrives and answers all of his questions with a simple,
Yeah, you know what I mean?
then declares him retarded for his way of speaking and charges him $5 billion. Then, when Joe notices the date 2505 on the bill, he finally realizes that he has been in the time capsule for 500 years. Stunned, he runs to the window and is shocked to see the state of the city. Buildings are collapsing on top of each other, some barely held up by ropes, and the city is full of garbage. The doctor panics when he sees that Joe doesn't have citizen tattoo on his wrist, a barcode to scan. Joe gets scared and runs away from the hospital, while the doctor calls the police because he's unscannable. He runs through the streets paying closer attention to his surroundings, and what he sees only increases his astonishment. The advertisements promote tobacco with slogans that insult non-smokers. In this world, hyper-consumerism is what dominates. Advertising is everywhere, even in names.
Mountain Dew, Herbert Camacho.
They barely know how to distinguish what is an ad and what isn't. Their clothes, the courtroom, the White House, everything is advertised. The most popular movie in the country is called Ass. Joe goes to see the Oscar-winning film and discovers it's just an ass farting on screen for 90 minutes. As night fell, hungry and searching for something to eat, Joe stumbled upon a vending machine. He watched a woman angrily fighting with the machine, claiming she's been scammed and that her children were hungry. In response, the machine sprayed her with a tranquilizer, knocking her unconscious. When Joe was left alone, he tried to get some food from the machine, but his luck didn't improve. He's arrested for not having the tattoo and not paying his hospital bill. For these infractions, Joe is taken to a public trial that has the aesthetic of a television program. He's assigned Frito as his lawyer. The judge mocks him, while while everyone in the courtroom laughs. Frito protests, not to defend Joe, but because Joe ruined his apartment and interrupted his favorite show. Desperate, Joe tries to explain his situation logically, but the short-minded people around him just laugh. Finally, the judge finds him guilty and sentences him to jail. The film makes fun of how language has become incredibly simple, but people speak in broken sentences, rely on slang, and can barely hold a meaningful conversation.
Alone.
Today, we spend so much time scrolling through short posts, quick videos, and endless headlines that we get used to for information being fast and effortless. Long explanations start to feel like too much work, so we look for the shortest possible answer, even if it's incomplete or misleading. We text in abbreviations, replace words with emojis or memes, and often skip the details altogether. The reason this matters is because language shapes the way we think. The fewer words and ideas we're able to express, the harder it becomes to deal with complicated topics. If we stop practicing deep thinking, we gradually lose the ability to do it well. And when people can't explain complex ideas, they also struggle to understand them. That's exactly what we see in Idiocracy. The characters can barely have a coherent conversation because their thinking has become just as limited as their vocabulary. They don't know how to question ideas, debate different perspectives, or think through a problem. They mostly react to whatever is happening right in front of them. It's easy to see a small hint of that in the real world. Meaningful conversations often get replaced with quick one-liners, comment sections, or viral catchphrases. Short-form content dominates our attention, and many of our discussions end before anyone has a chance to add context or nuance. As a result, people are more likely to react emotionally than to take the time to think things through. The movie pushes the idea to an extreme. Instead of discussing problems or trying to understand each other, people act impulsive. When people stop thinking critically, impulse starts making the decisions instead. Meanwhile, Rita leaves her pod and tries to call her boss manager and boyfriend, but the phone demands $2,000 to connect. A man approaches her, and she easily tricks him into giving her money. Meanwhile, Joe is taken to an automated tattoo machine that assigns scannable IDs. When he tries to explain that he's unsure of what's happening, the machine registers his name as not sure and tattoos it on his wrist. He's then subjected to certain IQ tests, extremely basic tests, which Joe passes without any difficulty. He's surprised to find that no one around him can even identify simple shapes. After this, he's sent to prison. Finally, Joe realizes that everyone in this world is incredibly stupid. So he tells the guard that today is his day out, and the guard, without question, lets him out. But the alarms detect the escape, and the police begin to chase him. Somehow, Joe manages to escape and return home to Frito, where he realizes the television sponsored by absurd products keep the population distracted and arrogant, where he is seen about to watch an adult content and train one hand more than the other. Joe believes someone must have invented a time machine in the last 500 years, and asks Frito if one exists. Frito says yes, but refuses to take him because Joe doesn't have any money. Then, Joe promises him that if he takes him, when he returns to 2005, he'll open an account in his name, and in 500 years, it'll be worth billions. But since Frito has trouble with numbers, Joe simply tells him he'll give him $80 billion. Finally, Frito agrees to help him. Another idea Idiocracy seems to predict is the decline of sustained attention. Reading a book or wrestling with a difficult idea used to require patience. You had to follow an argument, connect different concepts, and sit without uncertainty before reaching a conclusion. Today, that kind of deep focus is constantly interrupted. Our attention is pulled in every direction by endless notifications, infinite scrolling, and an endless stream of short-form content. Instead of staying with one thought, we're encouraged to consume bite-sized pieces of information before immediately moving on to the next. As a result, concentrating for long periods of time become more difficult, and shallow engagement starts to replace genuine understanding. The most popular shows are mindless spectacles built around cheap laughs and instant gratification. It's absurd, but the underlying idea feels familiar. While today's content is obviously more sophisticated, many platforms reward whatever is quickest to consume and easiest to digest. As videos get shorter and algorithms prioritize constant engagement, it becomes harder to slow down, think deeply, and give complex ideas the attention they deserve. Just then, the police knock on the door looking for Joe. The two escape through the window and take a car to the museum. On the way, they find Rita, who is still scamming the same man. She gets in, worried about her boss, unaware that he's already dead. While they're driving, a scanner detects Joe's wrist and alerts the police. The system shuts off the electrical car, and they must abandon the car before the police arrive, because when it arrives, they unleash a hail of bullets on the car with utter brutality, even launching missiles. At dawn, where they arrive in the suburbs surrounding a gigantic Costco store. Once inside the enormous store, Frito Frito guides them through the endless aisles in search of a train to take them further. He explains that he knows the place because both he and his father studied law there. As they walk, Joe observes with curiosity that some brands he used to know, like Starbucks, now offered ladies of the night. Remember when I told you this movie was censored by Fox themselves? Well, at the time of its release, Fox did no advertising and screened it in the fewest possible theaters. But what was the reason? The film, besides strongly criticizing American culture, did something worse for the production company. It negatively associated major brands that sponsored the film. This led them to decide to scuttle their own film so as not to offend these companies. Which is quite funny because it's self-fulfilling prophecy, since in the film, as we'll see, it's the corporations themselves that lead the world, not the politicians or judges. It's a corporation that decides what to show and how to control the masses with distractions and stimuli. But we will see this in a moment. When the group arrives at the waiting point for the train, Rita decides to make a quick stop in the bathroom. Frito approaches Joe and tells him everything he plans to do to Rita, a very good example of how adult content has affected his mind, basically turning him into a degenerate. Joe is mistakenly scanned and he's identified as a criminal. The subway arrives and Frito gets on, but Joe is waiting for Rita and is arrested. This time, instead of being taken to jail, he's taken to the White House because the IQ test declared him the most intelligent man on the planet. A teenager who is the Secretary of Energy tells him that he's even smarter than President Camacho. Joe then meets the rest of the team and the President Camacho himself, who's a former wrestling champion and adult film actor, mocked him by saying he hoped his head was bigger. The President of the United States of this future appoints him Secretary of the Interior in a spectacular conference in Parliament. The President, with a machine gun firing into the air, puts on a circus like a spectacle, as if it were a television program, a show, and the President would be the best showman of all. That's why he was elected President. Do you see the similarities in our current world? With an explosive speech, he acknowledges the country situation is critical. There's hunger, dust storms, and an alarming shortage of potato chips and crops, which is basically the same plot of Interstellar. I don't know, I just thought it was funny to mention. Camacho announces that his new secretary will resolve the food shortages and dust storms in less than a week. He also promises to pardon him if he solves the problem. Idiocracy is composed of the Greek words idiot and kratos, idiots and power. So in this harsh reality, politics is relegated to a circus act. Science is nullified and subjected to market interests. Environmental pollution reaches extreme levels. The population is trapped by the immediate gratification of extreme consumerism, adult content, and junk food. Health is left in private hands, and the system, in turn, encourages people to become increasingly stupid, sedentary, and enslaved to the dopamine rush of advertising and marketing. After this strange ceremony, Camacho and his caravan tour the city while the president reveals to Joe that he has decided to grant him a presidential pardon since Congress believed his promises. Later, when the cabinet meets, they await Joe's order. The secretaries ask Joe to say something intelligent. Joe blurts out some complicated words at random. Everyone is convinced of his intelligence. Joe asks Frito to draw a map of the time machine while he distracts the secretaries. Later, he takes the cabinet to a field where crops should be growing and asks them to bring Rita, as she could help him in the field. Frito secretly passes the map to Joe. Just as Rita arrives, Joe pulls her aside, planning to escape with the map, but his plan fails when he sees that Frito only drew a line. Then Joe notices they have been watering the crops with a sports energy drink instead of watering it because supposedly the drink has electrolytes. Everyone keeps saying this drink is good because it has electrolytes, but no one knows what electrolytes are. It turns out that the energy drink had replaced water everywhere since it represented a threat to their profits during the budget crisis of 2320. The corporation simply bought the Department of Health and the Communication Commission, allowing them to control what was said, done, and sold. One of the film's smartest ideas is using Brondo as a metaphor for what happens when corporations become so powerful that protecting profits becomes more important than solving obvious problems. Even as the crops continue to die, nobody seriously questions whether watering them with sports drink is the reason. The system has too many people invested in keeping the lie alive. Politicians, businesses, and ordinary citizens all benefit from maintaining the status quo, even when reality is staring them in the face. Once money and influence become deeply intertwined, common sense is often the first casualty. It's difficult not to draw comparisons to the real world. We regularly see industries continue practices that raise long-term concerns because the short-term financial incentives are simply too strong. The rapid expansion of AI, for example, has sparked debates about the enormous electricity and freshwater demands of some data centers. Yet the conversation often centers on growth and profits rather than whether that pace is sustainable. When corporate interests become powerful enough, society can end up ignoring problems that should be impossible to overlook. The film suggests that one of the first casualties of declining society is critical thinking.
Brondo's got what plants crave. Yeah, it's got electrolyte.
Instead of questioning the information they're given, people accept it as face value. They stop evaluating evidence, stop asking follow-up questions, and settle for whatever explanation is the easiest to digest. As a result, they're far easier to manipulate and are far more likely to believe confident statements over accurate ones. That pattern appears throughout Idiocracy. Joe repeatedly tricks authority figures with almost no effort because they never stop to examine what he's telling them. Rita easily deceives her clients for the same reason. Most importantly, the sports drink company convinces an entire civilization that crops need a sports drink simply because it has electrolytes. Nobody asks what electrolytes actually do. Nobody performs the simplest experiment with plain water, and nobody challenges the company's claims. The idea spreads because it's repeated often enough by people seen as trustworthy. The problem is that they've lost the habit of questioning. When this happens, they can sell us the most absurd ideas, and it can become accepted as common knowledge, simply because everyone else already believes them. Joe calls a cabinet meeting to propose watering the crops with water instead of brawn. The secretaries think it's an absurd idea. After several failed attempts to reason with them, Joe decides to change tactics and simply tell them that they can talk to the plants and that they want water. Joe didn't know the energy drink had accumulated salt in the soil, killing the plants and causing dust storms. However, his idea actually solves the problem. As Secretary of the Interior, Joe orders that all crops be watered and promises that in the time, the plants will grow and the storm will disappear. For a few days, everything seems to be going well, and Joe is close to being pardoned. But soon, the value of brown stock falls to zero due to low production, leaving half of the population unemployed. People riot outside the White House. Soon, the media, with its semi-naked and muscular presenter, begins a fierce campaign against Joe, accusing him of being a negligent politician. The situation escalates quickly, and Joe is taken to court for decisions. Since there are no video records of what happened, the reporter narrates less boring parts with drawings. The proceeding judge, overcome by adrenaline and ignorance, ignored his words and declared him guilty, sentencing him to 1 night of rehabilitation. Joe initially thinks that the sentence doesn't sound so terrible, but Davis quickly clarifies that in rehabilitation last week, the convicted man was crushed by a monster truck to the delight of the public. Rita visits Joe in jail, but he tells her that this time he can't escape because he's chained to a rock. He asks her to find Frito and go to the time machine without him, telling him not to wait for him. She hesitates, but Joe insists and asks her to tell people to read, study, and use their brains. He thinks that maybe the world turned out this way because of people like him who never did anything. Joe asks Rita to never stop painting and to continue being the artist she is. Joe is taken to the arena, while a sad Rita returns to the White House to leave in the time machine. Before that, Frito turns on the TV to watch the live rehab. Joe is chased by 2 huge killer trucks while driving a small car, since the door won't close because of the chain that binds him to the rock. The guards decide to put the rock on top of the car, making the whole setup even more absurd. At that moment, Rita sees a rose bush growing outside the White House and realizes that Joe's ideas worked. She asks Frito to take her to the arena and tries to tell the president Camacho, but he ignores her. Then, seeing a cameraman, she gets the idea to broadcast the crops on television to save Joe. She bribes the cameraman to film the crops with Frito and then take control of the monitoring panel. However, when the 2 fools arrived, they were distracted by Starbucks girls, promotion that was 2 for 1 deal. Meanwhile, Joe continues fighting for his life. He manages to cause the trucks to crash and be destroyed. When the trucks crash into each other, destroying themselves in an explosion of metal sparks, the audience, who had been in the edge of their seats, were disheartened to see that Joe had survived. However, from the wreckage emerged Beef Supreme, armed to the teeth and ready to finish Joe once and for all. Joe reaches for a microphone and in her heartfelt speech asks the people to trust that the water will bring back their food and that they shouldn't condemn someone who wants to help them. But the audience only mocks him. Meanwhile, Frito, after enjoying the nightly service, finally remembered his mission. Reading a sign, he recalled the plan, and when the cameraman questioned his manhood for trying to use his brain, Frito responds with a punch that knocked the cameraman right in front of the flowering plant. Rita immediately broadcasts the image on national television. Finally, Frito showed the cultivated fields on the live broadcast, proving to the whole country that Joe was right. Just as Beef Supreme was about to incinerate Joe, President Camacho intervened, saving him. With a broad smile, Camacho announced to everyone that Joe had just earned a presidential pardon. Then, everyone celebrates at a party in the White House. Joe thanks Rita for saving him. She confesses that she prefers to stay in the future because she had bad habits she doesn't want to return to. Plus, she'll be the CEO of this future Starbucks. Joe is surprised, but respects her decision. They say their goodbyes, but before Joe leaves, the president calls him to the stage and appoints him vice president. Joe insists on returning him to his own time, but when everyone begs him to stay because they need his help, he finally agrees. The final revelation came when Joe and Rita discovered that the supposed time machine was nothing more than a fairground attraction. The history walk presented a distorted vision of the past, where Charles Chaplin attempted to conquer Europe with an army of dinosaurs during World War II. Months later, Joe is elected president of the United States. Rita becomes first lady and Friedel vice president. Under their leadership, a new era begins in which the hope of humans will become intelligent again. Joe and Rita have their 3 children considered the smartest in the world, while Friedel marries 8 women and has 32 children, the dumbest in history. Joe may have not saved humanity, but at least he's got things moving. And that's not bad for someone mediocre. Concluding with a positive message about education and truly developing our brains, the question isn't whether we'll end up exactly in the movie. The point is that Idiocracy is an exaggerated reflection of trends we're already seeing, such as mainstream media marketers' overstimulation and the lack of our own thoughts, instead of being seduced by instant gratification that would ultimately lead to our downfall.